Hi everyone, I'm Catherine Leggat Barr, a senior in the School of Republic and International Affairs, and also pursuing a certificate in global health. I'm from Maine originally, and this summer I did a COVID-19 demography internship under Professor Noreen Goldman, as well as a graduate student named Fumia Yukoshi. And this internship sort of had two main goals. One was to produce a paper on disparities in COVID, sort of very broadly, and just sort of to gather literature about the pandemic in relation of just how it's experienced differently by different communities. So I decided that my contribution would be to look specifically at Native Americans in the United States and how they have been differentially affected, mostly in the mortality space due to COVID-19. We decided to look at mortality rates instead of incidence rates because incidence can be very state dependent in terms of how much testing is going on and very, very place dependent. So we thought that mortality rates would be a better indicator of how the pandemic is differentially affecting the Native American community across the United States. So as many of you are obviously already aware, the COVID pandemic has really affected communities in very different ways across the United States. And initially it was sort of billed as the great equalizer in terms of no one had immunity to this and it was a pathogen that was pretty equal opportunity. But I think we're seeing increasingly as this pandemic goes on that disadvantaged and marginalized communities are certainly more affected by the pandemic generally than non-marginalized or non-minority communities. And Native American communities have been definitely especially affected, but there's certainly sort of little literature on why this is and sort of to what degree they have been differentially affected. So that was sort of the rationale for this project of how to really look in depth of how mortality risks are different in the Native American community versus the white community generally in the United States, and really and then also the follow-up question is why is there this disparity that exists? So we looked at this both on a national level as well as a state level, and then analyzed relevant variables that could explain the higher mortality rates that we observed. So the methods for this project primarily were quantitative. We looked at a lot of data, both of mortality rates that were published, or mortality data that was published by the CDC to calculate the risk mortality ratios, which basically is an indicator of how much more likely one group is to die of a certain illness versus another. And we made sure that these were age and place standardized, as obviously older people have been more likely to die of coronavirus than younger people. We also used various federal data collection service sources, such as the American Community Survey, the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance Survey, and just general US Census data to analyze salient factors that we saw in other literature that explained elevated mortality rates to try to talk about why we saw these elevated risk mortality ratios among Native Americans. And so my role in this project, I worked alongside Professor Goldman as well as Fumia, and I sort of came up with the idea to look at the Native American community. I actually wrote my JP on the Native American community, so I was already familiar with sort of the unique challenges that they face. And so I wanted to look at this very obviously relevant problem with coronavirus in these communities. And I did a lot of the research surrounding background research around Native Americans, as well as gathering data on the relevant variables that could sort of answer the why question, and also drafted most of the paper. But it was an incredibly collaborative team effort from all three participants in the group. So I sort of alluded to some of the results already, but basically what we found was that when you age in place standardize the risk mortality ratios, Native Americans were 3 times more likely to die of coronavirus than whites. And this risk mortality ratio was higher than the elevated mortality rate for both Latinos and Blacks. So by analyzing these 3 groups, it revealed that Native Americans are one of the most vulnerable minority groups within the United States relative to coronavirus mortality, which was pretty striking and pretty salient given the significantly higher rates, risk mortality ratios. We also looked at the risk mortality ratios among states, and as you can see in figure 2, there is a large variation in the risk mortality ratios between states. So South Dakota, Utah, and Mississippi, you can see those very distinct blue lines. Those states had very much higher risk mortality rates than other states, but as you can see also in New Mexico and Arizona, those are the 2 states with one of the largest percentage populations of Native Americans, about 10%, I think. Those states had very elevated risk mortality ratios as well. And I think those 2 states are probably the best indicators of sort of this trend because of their substantial population within the states. Mississippi, I think, could be explained by, to some degree, having a pretty small population. So, a couple more deaths on either side could cause a massive increase in the risk mortality ratio. But as you can see, sort of across the board, Native American risk mortality ratios were higher in most states. And we found that very interesting, that there was such a degree of variation between states, but also that most states appeared to have higher risk mortality ratios among Native Americans. So after we established sort of figure 1 and figure 2 that mortality rates appeared to be higher among Native Americans, we tried to explain why that was. And obviously, explaining the why question is oftentimes much harder than explaining sort of what is happening on a sort of general level. But so I wouldn't say that we came to a super definitive, clear answer. But as you can see in figure 3, we really saw that Native American reservation status, so basically it was defined by the percentage of Native Americans within a given state that live on a reservation, that appeared to correlate with a higher risk mortality ratio, as you can see in figure 3. Causation or causality was certainly not established in this graphic, but it does point to, at least to some degree, a correlation between reservation status and higher mortality rates. And just a quick background on reservations. Reservations are basically tracts of land that have been given to Native Americans, or not given, but basically they were Native Americans during the forced migration. That is where most settled, and they have very unique governing patterns, and so certainly they have advantages, including being able to preserve the culture and community oftentimes of Native Americans, but there's also high rates of poverty, water insecurity, food insecurity, which all likely increase one's risk of dying from COVID-19. So certainly sort of the historical legacies on these places are pretty mixed, as it does provide a place for culture to continue in a large community setting, but it also is sort of the result of pretty bad federal policy on the fact of forced relocation and forced migration. So as I said, like it's pretty clear that Native Americans appear to be dying at higher rates of or more likely to die of coronavirus than whites across the United States when standardized for age and place. And reservation status appeared to play a role in increasing that risk. We also looked at 5 other salient variables, including occupation status, access to healthcare, pre-existing conditions, differentials in state policies, and also like living situations, like how many people live in a given house, as intergenerational spread is a big concern with coronavirus, obviously, as older people are more likely to die, and found that Native Americans oftentimes live in an intergenerational house much more frequently than whites. And we also saw that the pre-existing conditions, especially diabetes and obesity, both of which have been identified as risk factors for increased severity as well as mortality due to coronavirus contraction. We found that was much higher among the Native American community as well. That could also explain the elevated, or at least partially explain the elevated mortality rates. But I think sort of a common trend that we found throughout the research process was that data on Native American communities is very limited, and which makes it very difficult to sort of probe the why question specifically. And this is incredibly detrimental when trying to construct literature about these communities. And I think increased data surveillance and collection is certainly needed to be able to establish more definitive claims about why this is happening. In terms of the questions that I have, I think one, I would be really interested in looking at how do social factors or patterns drive the spread of coronavirus, especially in Native American communities, especially on reservations, as reservations are some of the most spread out places. They're very rural, but like how are these spreading patterns happening? Is it at the local store? Is it at a community gathering place? Like why does it appear that the spread is higher on these reservations? And then also I would be interested to look at just sort of, again, like why are these reservations the hotspots of COVID-19 given the vast distance that exists? In terms of conclusions, I think I've covered it, but basically that Native Americans have been differentially affected across the country by COVID-19, but improved data collection is certainly necessary to establish the answer to the why question. I think that is a really important policy implication of this poster and paper, that we really need to be addressing this data sort of chasm and gap. So just quickly, I want to acknowledge the Center for Health and Wellbeing and thank them so much for creating this internship so last minute. A lot of our summer plans obviously were really put into flux, and so I really appreciate them thinking quickly and establishing this. I also really want to thank my 2 partners, Professor Goldman and Bumia, for working tirelessly with me to research, write, and draft this paper. Your thoughts and help and have been truly invaluable, and I'm excited to continue to work on this paper to finalize it, hopefully for submission at some point. So and I also just wanted to say that I really appreciate you allowing me to work on this topic that neither one of you had much prior experience with, as I think that it was, so I really appreciate you taking that extra effort. So thank you, and if you have any questions about my research, please feel free to contact me.